Hello, I'm Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Second World War. And today we're going to be discussing Ireland's role in the Second World War, and we're going to have our regular co-host Joe Quinn and four special guests. So before we get going, I'm going to bring Joe in. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Eddie. How are you doing? Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, happy St. Patrick's Day, Joe. So we've got a lot to talk about. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring in our guests.
Okay.
So
in the past year or so, there's been a lot of chaff on social media with regard to Ireland's wartime neutrality and our stance in the war, and sort of not a lot really being known with regard to sort of the realities of that neutrality, and also the fact that there was a part of Ireland, i.e. Northern Ireland, that was actively involved in the war and was partaking in the UK and Allied war effort, and had a significant role, and was also a conduit for feeding Irish recruits into the British Armed Forces. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to have a discussion with three and possibly a fourth panelist at a later point in this discussion to fully interrogate all the various different issues around Ireland's participation or lack thereof, or unofficial participation, whatever you want to call it. We were neutral, but not completely in spirit. So,
Joe, before you press on, could I just say one thing about myself? Because I'm a Londoner. I was born in London. My parents were born in London, but I'm of London Irish descent. And my father served in the Irish Brigade, London Irish Rifles, and in 17th of March 1944, he was preparing for the Fourth Battle of Cassina. So they had a St. Patrick's Day celebration south of Cassina, and then they had another one, of course, on 1945, and a righteous St. Patrick's Day celebration in northern Italy just before the final offensive. And that's it. So anyway, Joe, do you want to see the slides?
Yes, well, I wanted to make introductions. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Peter Devitt, who formerly is curator at the Royal Air Force Museum and continues to do so. He specialised on the participation of particular groups, particularly community groups that had a role within the Royal Air Force. So particularly, he was the main curator for an exhibition called Pilots of the Caribbean, which featured very prominently in the media. And he's also a specialist on the Irish role in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. So he has a massive, shall we say, portfolio of work that he undertook with the RAF. And he still continues, since he left the RAF Museum, he still continues to do a lot of public-facing work with regard to the RAF and outreach. The next person I'd like to introduce is Stephen O'Connor. Dr. Stephen O'Connor is a lecturer in modern British history at the Sorbonne University in Paris, and Stephen currently is basically doing research on the concept of army liaison with the British Army, its cooperation with other armed forces. But his background research was on the Irish in the armed forces during the Second World War, and he specifically carried out work on the role of Irish officers in the British forces. So he had a book published in 2014, Irish Officers in the British Forces, 1922 to 1945, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan. The next person I'd like to introduce is Jim O'Neill, and Jim O'Neill is a collections officer with the Northern Ireland War Memorial, and he oversees Second World War content accessions, particularly an oral history project involving Second World War veterans and eyewitnesses, as well as the accession of physical object heritage from the period of the Second World War. So the person I'd like to first go to, we're going to field the whole series of questions, is Peter Devitt on the Irish and the Royal Air Force. So I'm just going to open up the slides, Peter. Be sure to unmute yourself, Peter, as well. The first question is, what was the Irish role in the Royal Air Force? Could you tell us a little bit about the Irish in the Air Force? Who were the major significant figures, and what was their overall role in the global Royal Air Force during the Second World War, as well as the air defence of the United Kingdom?
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. I've written a few notes, and we'll have a gallop through some of the stories and some facts and some figures, and then I'll leave it to the academics. Good evening, everyone, and happy St. Patrick's Day. If I may begin on a personal note, my grandfather, Jack Devitt from Cabra in North Dublin, joined the RAF in 1943 and served as an AC2 at RAF Coningsby, the Bomber Command Airfield in Lincolnshire. I only met him twice, but I'm told that he was very proud of his wartime service. I'm also told he firmly believed that Ireland had the right to remain neutral during the war. When working at the RAF Museum, I had the privilege and great pleasure of interviewing Flight Lieutenant Ken Paddy French, a corpsman who flew Spitfires with 66 Squadron from 1943 to 1945. After VE Day, Ken met a beautiful English WAF officer named Joan Louise Warner, who had worked in the operations room at RAF Bentley Priory at Stanmore. They married, settled in Essex, and had a family. Jane, their daughter, is a talented artist, and I'm proud to call her a friend. In August 1914, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland declared war on Germany. Some 6,000 Irish volunteers served with the Royal Flying Corps, Royal Naval Air Service, and Unified Royal Air Force. 500 of these men lost their lives. Irishmen made, perhaps predictably, excellent fighter pilots, and 495 aerial victories were credited to only 39 Irish aces. One such ace was Major Joseph Croyce Callahan of County Dublin. Nicknamed the Mad Major, Callahan died as he had lived and was last seen attacking 25 German fighters single-handed in his Sopwith Dolphin. Another was Captain George McElroy from Dublin City, who was credited with 47 aerial victories while flying SE-5As. The most successful pilots were Victoria Cross winners Major James McCudden and Major Edward Mannock, two working-class heroes from the Irish diaspora in England. They were credited with 57 and 61 victories, respectively. All four officers were killed in July 1918. The stories of these men and others like them would inspire youngsters growing up in Britain, Ireland, and all over the Empire and Commonwealth in the interwar years. Many of these youngsters would volunteer to serve as RAF aircrew during the Second World War. In January 1919, the Anglo-Irish War began. 2.5 years of bitter fighting followed, but in December 1921, a treaty was signed which created a 26-county Irish Free State and left 6 counties of Ulster under British rule. Charles Russell and Jack McSweeney, two former RAF officers, were on standby with a Martinsyde Type A biplane to spirit Michael Collins back to Ireland if the talks failed. The Martinsyde, named the Big Fella, was the Irish state's first military aircraft. During the Second World War, over 15,000 Northern and Southern Irish people volunteered for the RAF, serving in all commands and in all theatres, and 1,300 of these people became casualties. Wherever they went, the Irish earned a reputation for courage, fortitude, and good humour. Excuse me. 3 posthumous Victoria Crosses were awarded to Irish pilots. The RAF's first VCs of the war went to flying officer Donald Garland from Wicklow and his observer, Sergeant Thomas Gray, for their part in the attack on the Veld-Vezelt Bridge in Belgium on the 12th of May 1940. Garland's 3 brothers, Desmond, John, and Patrick, would also lose their lives serving with the wartime RAF. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, a Tipperary man serving in the Fleet Air Arm, won the VC leading a flight of Fairey Swordfish against the German capital ships Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prince Eugen during the Channel Dash of the 12th of February 1942. Interestingly, Eugene Esmond's great-uncle, Thomas Esmond, was awarded the Victoria Cross serving with the 18th Foot, later Royal Irish Regiment, during the Crimean War. Lastly, Flight Lieutenant David Lord, a former seminarian from Cork, earned his VC at the controls of a burning Dakota during a resupply flight during the Battle of Arnhem on the 19th of September 1944. One of the pilots to have reported that the German battleships had broken out was Group Captain Victor Beamish, who was born at Dunman Way, County Cork, in 1903. 6 weeks later, Beamish was killed in a combat over the Channel at the age of 38. A talented rugby player and the eldest of 4 brothers, who were also sportsmen serving in the RAF, Beamish was at the time station commander at RAF Kenley. While there, he got on well with Brendan Paddy Finucane, the Dublin-born commander of 602 Squadron. Charming, photogenic, and popular, The young Irishman was credited with destroying 28 enemy aircraft between the 12th of August 1940 and the 8th of June 1942. He was himself killed leading the Hornchurch wing on the 15th of July when his Spitfire was hit by ground fire and plunged into the Channel. At only 21 years of age, Paddy Finucane was the RAF's youngest wing commander. His father, Andrew Finucane, had fought against the British during the Easter Rising of 1916. Beamish and Finucane are two of 10 Irish nationals recognised on the Battle of Britain London Monument, and as I'm sure you're aware, the last of the Battle of Britain few, Group Captain John Hemingway, DFC, passed away on St. Patrick's Day last year, aged 105. Irish nationals served with Bomber Command, and an estimated 250 of their number were killed. During a raid on Wilhelmshaven on the 4th of September 1939, Pilot Officer William Joseph Murphy's Blenheim bomber was shot down, and he and his crew were killed. Murphy, a corpsman serving with 107 Squadron, became the first RAF pilot to be killed in action during the war. The same day, Tipperary-born AC-1 Larry Slattery, an air gunner on another 107 Squadron Blenheim, was shot down, and he became the first RAF prisoner of war. He would not be liberated until April 1945 and was the longest-serving Craigie. Slattery was a talented violinist, and he organised concerts for his fellow prisoners to keep himself occupied. Another Irish-born POW was Flying Officer Paddy Barthrop, Battle of Britain veteran, shot down and captured near Saint-Omer on the 17th of May 1942. Barthrop was involved in the Great Escape from Starligel 3 at Sargon in March 1944, but mercifully was still in the tunnel when the alarm was raised, and thus avoided being numbered among the 50 Air Force officers murdered by the Gestapo on Hitler's orders. Yesterday, Eddie O'Sullivan, who has organised this event with Dr. Joseph Quinn, mentioned the importance of the Irish diaspora communities. Within the RAF, one can point to Pilot Officer Art Donahue from Minnesota, Pilot Officer Vernon Shorty Keogh from New Jersey, who were founder members of 71 Squadron, the first of the 3 Eagle Squadrons. Vernon Keogh was only 4 feet 10 and had to sit on 2 cushions to be able to see out of his cockpit. Sadly, both men were later killed. We should also nod to Flight Lieutenant Joe McCarthy from New York State. Big Joe, as he was known, was one of the pilots who attacked the Sorpa Dam during Operation Chastise on the night of the 16th-17th May 1943. I'd like to finish with the story of Corporal Lillian Barder, née Bailey, who was born in Liverpool on the 18th of February 1917. Lillian's father was a Barbadian who had served in the Royal Navy, and her mother was Irish. Orphaned at the age of 9, Lillian was brought up in a convent. On the 28th of March 1941, Lillian Barder volunteered to join the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and opted to train as an instrument repairer. During her training, she received the news that her brother Jim, who was serving in the Merchant Navy, had been killed at sea. Posted to RAF Shawbury in Shropshire, Lillian checked the instruments of the Airspeed Oxford trainers based there. 1943, Lillian met and then married Ramsay Barder, a black tank driver serving with the Essex Yeomanry. She fell pregnant and was discharged from the WAF in February 1944. After the war, Lillian studied for a degree at London University and became a teacher in Bournemouth. Her younger son, Geoffrey, flew helicopters with the Royal Navy and later became an airline pilot. Lillian Barder was one of the people chosen to feature in the Royal Mail's Valour and Victory stamp issue commemorating the 80th anniversary, the end of World War II, in July 2024. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Peter. I have to say that I was very gratified that you adverted to John Hemingway passing away on St. Patrick's Day last year. I was not one of the first to hear about it in the UK, but with the help of Ronan McGreevy, who I think might be joining us a little bit later for this discussion, both myself and Ronan were the first to break the news in the Republic of Ireland, or to Ireland generally. So Ronan, actually, I informed Ronan and put a quotation together, and he published it in the Irish Times, and it was published just literally before midnight on the evening of St. Patrick's Day. So it was it was considered to be quite a watershed moment, sort of the passing into history of an era, really, where sort of these great, shall we say, figures of, shall we say, national defiance, resistance, and salvation basically passed from living memory with the death of John Hemingway. And John Hemingway was born in Dublin, and he passed away in Dublin, a very proud Irishman. I just wanted to ask you, before we move on to discussing the role of the Irish in the British Army with Stephen, I wanted to ask you, Peter, as somebody who has specialised in Royal Air Force history for as long as you have, and being somebody from an Irish background yourself, and somebody who specialises to some degree on the Irish in the RAF, what, to your mind, was the overarching significance of Hemingway becoming the last of the few and passing the way he did on St. Patrick's Day, in that extraordinary moment where basically you had two countries grieving side by side the passing of an Irishman who had served in British uniform? I think it was rather unprecedented. Have you any thoughts on that matter?
I would say, speaking as somebody who's very much from the Airfix generation, waking up the next morning to realise there were no more Battle of Britain pilots was something that was quite sobering for me personally. What I would also say, I've seen a number of quite remarkable things. The Battle of Britain memorial flight over Dublin, for example. I would never have thought I would see that in my lifetime. So on a personal level, I would say that. What I would say is also, it's one of those things that brings us together, because it is very, very easy to find the differences. What I would say is I personally believe that we need to build social cohesion. And one of the best ways of looking at that, of doing that, is to look at the Royal Air Force in the Second World War, which was immensely diverse and immensely successful. People from all over the world came to Britain for whatever reason. They might have been exiles from occupied Europe, Eastern Europe, Poles and Czechs, Western Europe, French, Norwegians, Belgians. They might have been volunteers from the United States or elsewhere. They may have been Irish people who may have had historic links with the country. They may have even fought, as Andy Finucane, who himself wanted to join the RAF. He had 3 sons in the British Armed Forces, and his English wife talked him out of it. But he was prepared to go. He had borne arms against the British in 1916. So you're looking at a number of things. It seems, and this is something I've picked up with very much with the African and Caribbean communities and the South Asian communities, is that it was possible for people who did not subscribe to the tenets of British colonial rule or any notion of British superiority, who would still come and fight, and if necessary, risk their lives in support of what Britain represented as the only nation that was still fighting. I find that personally, I find it very interesting. I find it very moving. I know that my grandfather did not come for king and country. He came because Hitler was bad and had to be stopped, and England was fighting. That's why he came. He came purely for moral reasons. He had a wonderful time. He was known as Paddy, just as the Scotsman known as Jock, the Welsh as Taffy. He contemplated staying in. He met people from all over the world. He met Australians, he met Poles, he met Jamaicans for the first time, all wearing the same uniform, all with their individual flashes, the national flashes on their shoulders. And he was part of that. And he was very proud of that part. He nevertheless remained an Irishman. And he never, ever brooked any discussion of violence, desire, or need to become a decision to remain neutral during that war.
That's very interesting. Right. Well, I'm going to return to you, Peter, in a short bit with regard to the whole wider question of neutrality, and perhaps a little bit with regard to sort of the officer candidates for the RAF, particularly certain Irish people who fitted into that role. But I'm just going to move next to the next question of the discussion, which is why did so many Irish join the British Army during the Second World War? And we see a photograph here which featured a bit on social media today. This is taken from the Imperial War Museum collection, and it's a photograph, a well-known photograph now at this particular point, of the men of the 2nd Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers who are basically on the line at Monte Cassino, or they're somewhere in the rear. And they get up in the morning and they stand to, I think they attend Mass, and then after Mass, or the Catholics attend Mass, and the Protestants in the battalion would attend their particular service. as was the custom on St. Patrick's Day, they would have a religious service, quick one, because they're on the line, and they received a rum ration to mark St. Patrick's Day on the 17th of March 1944. And this is the normal custom. Basically, you have a piper playing, and then basically all the men receive they're given rum on that particular day, but normally it would be whiskey or a pint of Guinness or something like that. It's the tradition within the Irish regiments in the British Army, and it's still continued to this day. And there's the normal giving of the shamrock within the Irish Guards Regiment. So, Stephen, I wanted to bring you in here on this particular point. So, the question I would have, and just be prepared to unmute yourself before you answer this question. So, the question I have for you is, why did so many Irish choose to join the British Army during the Second World War, and what was sort of the backdrop to basically sort of the very substantial Irish presence in the army, particularly given the controversial reputation that the army had in Ireland during the Irish War of Independence. Not say nothing of the fact that Irish had served in very large numbers in the First World War, but why did this tradition continue so strongly during the Second World War post-independence?
Yeah, that's the big question that got me into the research that I did for my PhD. It was exactly that. I mean, as you just said, there was a War of Independence in the south of Ireland. The Irish Republican Army fought the British Army. At the end of that, Ireland got some kind of independence. It became a dominion in the British Empire with self-government. And then when World War II started, Southern Ireland was neutral. So it is interesting. Why would Irish people, from that context, with that complicated history with Britain, why would any Irish people be joining the British Army? And as with anything, it's complicated. There are many reasons why Irish people joined the British Army, probably as many reasons as there were volunteers, Irish volunteers. But we can see some reasons that come up time and time again when you look at memoirs written by Irish veterans and interviews with veterans. So I would say there are four main reasons that are pretty common among the Irish who joined up. The first one would be family tradition. So as in any country that has an army, you have military families, fathers, grandfathers, a tradition of serving in the armed forces, and that existed in Ireland under British rule, so before 1922. And just because Ireland, got its independence, doesn't mean that tradition stopped. So if I have found examples of guys who served in World War II who grew up in families in the 1920s and 30s, and they grew up with a father or an uncle who was serving in the British Army or had served in the British Army, and they grew up in a house where they were always hearing stories about what it was like to be in the British Army, the war stories, the adventures that their father or whoever had, and that conditioned some people from early age to be interested in the British Army. That was something. Go and join the British Army. So you have people coming from family traditions. The next reason I would say loyalty to Britain. Here I'm talking specifically about the Protestant community in the south of Ireland. It is within that community that a lot of people within that community in the 1930s and 1940s would have identified themselves as British or as part of the British Empire, would have had a strong feeling of loyalty to the Crown and to Britain. And it was absolutely natural and even expected in many of those families that I call themselves Anglo-Irish, that they would enlist, that they would join up, especially when they had family members living in Britain and family members that were already serving. So you've got the loyalty motivation from that particular part of the population. Employment. Many Irish people were suffering during the Great Depression in Ireland in the 1930s, went over to Britain, and many of them went into the army. So this is even before the beginning of the war. And I'm sure there were many people that went into the British Army because they couldn't find employment in Ireland. But I would add to that it's too simple to just imagine that these people would join the British Army only for lack of other employment. In the war, they could have had better paid jobs by working in the different war industries, munitions factories, etc. And that kind of work was better paid and less risky than serving in the front line in the British Army. So I think it's not enough just to talk about an employment reason. It's often, when I look at the people who say they joined because they couldn't get any other job or they were desperate for a job, often they also mention a desire for adventure and excitement. So I think that has to be taken into account as well. It's not just looking for employment, it's adventure seekers, it's people who imagine the Army or the Navy or Air Force to be an opportunity for heroic adventures, travel to places they've never seen. And the last reason adventure is the last reason. I'm sure I've missed some. As I said, there are many individuals, therefore many different reasons.
No, Stephen, I would have to say that you covered that fairly sufficiently. I have researched the topic myself fairly extensively, as you know, and indeed my own focus was specifically on recruitment, I suppose the science behind Irish recruitment during the Second World War, both North and South, and sort of you're familiar with the motivation studies that have been conducted using oral history, and I conducted a major oral history study as part of my own PhD. And generally speaking, the adventure motive was a particularly strong one, particularly with the regard to, seek adventure. There was this idea that basically for manly men, that basically joining the British Army would make a man out of you. And you get to see the world. And particularly, I remember Jack Hart, who gave testimony to the University College Cork Volunteers Project Archive. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's an oral history archive project that was set up in the mid-1990s. So 1995 was when within the Irish sphere, I suppose, within national life, it suddenly became acceptable to start talking about the Irish role in the Second World War, and it started featuring in the news. And an Irish Prime Minister, our Taoiseach, John Bruton, became the first to pay tribute to the Irish who fought in the Second World War when he reopened the National War Memorial Gardens at Islandbridge, which had been previously neglected. So truth be told, you have multivarious reasons, but it's sort of the exoticism of it. Adventure is a very strong motivation, alongside family tradition. One of the things, and I'm sure Stephen would corroborate this, that the family tradition of service is very strong when it comes to Ireland, and people following a family path into the British forces is something that is a common thread throughout the ages, and particularly applies to the First and Second World War as well. And that brings me to my next question, and it's a very prescient point, because the person that you're seeing, the photograph you're seeing, is of Major James Hickey, who is not Protestant but Catholic, but sort of fits into an Anglo-Catholic mold. So they do exist in Ireland. You have people who would consider themselves to be Anglo-Irish Catholics. So you even have a composite sort of group that are similar to recusant Catholics, sort of, that operate within an elite, within a hierarchy. And the Hickeys were an example of a family who operated within very high tier circles within, shall we say, the dying structures of feudal Ireland. And they had a tradition of service in the British forces going back a very long way. So Major Hickey served in the Royal Fusiliers. That's the Tower of London Regiment. So it's the traditional regiment that would always have garrisoned the Tower, and that's their main traditional recruiting depot. And it was the same regiment that his father, who was Major General Sir Bernard Hickey, formerly the commander of the 16th Irish Division in the First World War, same regiment that he had served, and his father before him, and his father before him, going all the way back. And there was a proud tradition among the Hickeys of serving in the Royal Fusiliers, which is quite interesting for an Irish Catholic family, but it was a very well-established tradition. So what I wanted to ask you, Stephen, and you don't need to give me an exact number of how many Irish officers joined the British forces just generally, but how many did you survey? How many did you pick up? What were their motivations for joining? What kind of social backgrounds did they come from? And what kind of heights did many of them climb to, considering the fact that probably quite a number of them joined the armed forces for a career?
So I studied a sample of 1,000 officers from the south of Ireland, since that was my main interest. And I found these guys in many different places in lists of people who had won decorations and awards. I went to certain private schools that had a tradition of military service. So yeah, I had around 1,000 officers. I mean, before talking about my sample, I should say we don't know exactly how many Irish officers there were in the British forces in the war. There's a document from the War Office which talks about, I think, 3,500 Irish officers in the British Army in 1944. So that's a starting point. And we can imagine that roughly the same number in the Navy and the Air Force. So we're looking at thousands anyway, probably near to 10,000. But I had a sample of 1,000. And in terms of patterns about where they came from and their social background, a lot of them came from the east coast of Ireland, particularly Dublin, Wicklow, Wexford were well represented. Also in Munster, Cork and Tipperary were well represented as well. In terms of what kind of families they came from, well, it's not surprising that they came from middle class and upper class families, which is the classes that at that time the British Army targeted for in terms of, you know, who becomes an officer, who did they think was suitable to become an officer. It was going to be mainly people from well-educated upper and middle class backgrounds. Although at the end of the war, we start to see as the British Army introduces a selection process, which is, you know, trying to be scientific and meritocratic, that there are more and more people from modest working class backgrounds coming into the officer ranks as well, but predominantly middle and upper class. The sons of they tend to be the sons of officers or the sons of doctors, directors of companies, bank managers. Attended a private boarding school in Ireland or in Britain. They tended to be 19 or 20, 21 when they joined. This is the ones who joined during the war, so they joined, you know, as soon as they could, pretty much. In my sample of 1,000, a slight majority are Protestant, but there is a large number of Catholics. And what impressed me or surprised me a bit about the Catholics was, as the war goes on, there's more and more Irish officers who are coming from a Catholic background, and not necessarily coming from families with a very long connection to Britain, like your example of Hickey. Not necessarily coming from that. Even people who, a lot of them did have a connection with the First World War, had their father or uncle or someone else who had served in the First World War. So there was that, and that probably was quite important as an example, as an influence on these guys as the Second World War breaks out. And maybe that had a heavy influence on them. What else can I say about them? I think I've covered most of their social background anyway.
Well, yeah, that's fine. You're not just analysing army officers. I know the army is a sort of a primary aspect of your study. It's something that you can speak to quite strongly, and you still continue to work on the British Army in terms of sort of how it worked in a technical respect, particularly with regard to coordination and liaison with other forces. But One of the things I just would point to is the comments. In the comments section, we have a few remarks made about certain individuals. David Lord, the Beamishes, wasn't the Beamish one of the Beamish Stout family? And the answer to that question is yes. It's Victor Beamish, who was served in the Royal Air Force. He was one of the 10 Irishmen who fought in the Battle of Britain that we know of, and that includes John Hemingway, and who was lost in 42, just shortly before Wing Commander Brendan Finucane shot down over northern France, becoming the youngest wing commander. He became the youngest wing commander to be appointed to the rank of wing commander to date. So youngest person ever to attain that rank. So commanding the Hornchurch wing. But Beamish and Finucane were both dead by the middle of 42, which indicates the level of attrition that the RAF were suffering. So just a quick question for you, Stephen, and just for you, Peter, as well. With regard to the officer pilots who served in the Royal Air Force, who came from Ireland, was there a common motivation that could be traced according to your research or your work on them that basically inspired them to join the Air Force, such as a fascination with mechano sets, or with just a fascination with aviation, anything like that? Is there anything you could tell us about them? I'll start with you, Peter, and then I'll go to Stephen.
Just to say what Stephen has said is you've got all of the motivations there. There's the family connections. I know one pilot who was related to a long Anglo-Irish tradition that had gone military service, had gone on for many years, and he said to not to have gone would have be effectively been considered a white feather. So he's got his own motivation. Other people, adventure, flying Spitfires and Hurricanes. That's a big deal. Other people are just contemplating. I think David Lord thought a lot about what he was doing. Killy Kilmartin, very exciting person. And he just read, I recommend Patrick Bishop's trilogy, Fighter Boys. It's got the number of Irish people who are mentioned in that. And he'd started off, after he was orphaned, he was sent to an Australian sheep station, and then went from there to Shanghai, where he worked at the Shanghai Gas Works and became a jockey, and then traveled on the Orient Express, accompanied by Japanese sumo wrestlers to join up. This is one of the things. Another point that Patrick Bishop makes is a number of people who had dysfunctional childhoods who found themselves in the Royal Air Force, people where things had gone wrong. This was really their last chance to make something of themselves. So they were very determined. You have to have a certain level of education to fly. You have to have that aptitude. So you're looking at people who are educated to a certain level. The RAF is a good educator, incidentally. If they see talent, they will always bring people on, and could do that when needed a mass air force. But people who were joining up before the war, they tended to be very often what you expect. You see privately educated, whether in Ireland or in England, sometimes both. You'll see people going to Ampleforth and Stonyhurst, and you'll see those groups, as you'd imagine.
Thank you very much, Peter. Stephen, do you have any comments to make on this with regard to officers in the RAF? Because it's also a very important. The RAF, just to mention, is a service that basically has probably a comparable, almost a comparable. We don't really know the full number of Irish who served in the British Armed Forces, and it's something that we'll have to figure out in due course. But one of the things that is very clear is that the RAF was almost on a par with the Army in terms of the number of Irish that joined. There was an incredible number of Irish that flocked into the Royal Air Force from 41 onwards. In 1943, the single largest figure of recruits that's recorded for any branch of the armed forces at any point throughout the entire war is the over 5,000 Irish, Southern Irish, that are recorded by the Northern Irish recruiting authorities as going into the Royal Air Force. So it's the single largest figure. It's 3 times larger than any other figure for any particular group, north or south, for any branch of the armed forces. And it's particularly important to stress that 43 was a critical year in terms of desertions from the Irish Defence Forces, particularly the Irish Air Corps. So, Stephen, I just wanted to ask you, what common traits did you notice with regard to your studies of Irish Air Force officers, including those who continued on in the Royal Air Force post-war?
Well, I mean, in terms of what comes to my mind is in some of the oral history interviews with Irish people that were in the Royal Air Force, quite often they mention growing up reading Biggles, reading comic books about people in air warfare in the First World War, or Biggles' adventures, and that gave them a desire to follow that career, to fly planes. That gave them the idea that it was something exciting, and that interested them from their childhood. For example, Finucane's brother mentioned that from an early age they were reading Biggles. I wanted to give an example of another guy who joined the Royal Air Force, joined Bomber Command, and he probably joined out of boredom. You know his case well, Joe. I'm talking about Sean Drum. He's one of the people that gave an interview to the UCC Volunteers Project, and he's interesting because he was serving in the Irish Army Air Corps during the war, and in 1943 he said that the threat to Ireland was effectively gone. America had come into the war. The Battle of the Atlantic was pretty much over. Ireland was no longer in danger from Germany, and I was feeling that I was just wasting my time in the Irish Army Air Corps. There was nothing to do here. And he also emphasized the fact that they had such strong links with the Royal Air Force. They had people from the Royal Air Force apparently coming over and training them. They had manuals from the Air Ministry. They were using equipment from the RAF. So he emphasized the strong links. And so it seemed logical to him in 1943, if I'm not doing anything here, if I'm not useful here in Ireland, and I've got all this training, I should go to Britain and go where the action is. Probably because he thought it would be a great adventure as well. And he deserted and went over to Britain and joined the Royal Air Force, joined Bomber Command. So that's what I would say about reasons for joining.
Actually, it's funny you should mention that one, because Sean Drum was the person I wanted to also mention in this regard. It's funny because in his oral history interview with the UCC Volunteers Project, he's been prompted a lot by his wife. So he's living, I think, in Tullamore. He's living somewhere in the middle of Ireland, and he had a very distinguished career in the Air Force. I think he stayed on a little bit after the war, but I think he attained the rank of squadron leader, something like that. So he was a pilot, and he had no regrets about joining the RAF or leaving the Irish Air Corps. And when he was talking about his reasons for leaving the Irish Air Corps, he said there was a general feeling that staying on in the Air Corps was, and his wife in the background was going, waste of time. And he said, a waste of time in many respects and whatever. So she was kind of prompting him in the background, kind of like Nancy Reagan used to prompt Ronald Reagan whenever he had a senior moment. But it was kind of funny because Sean Drum kind of, he was very objective, very clear-minded about sort of motivations for joining the armed forces in those days. And when a lot of people think that Irish people would have a hang-up about joining the British Armed Forces, but he pointed out in his hometown of Tullamore that there was an active tradition of joining the armed forces going back years, because it was a garrison town. Tullamore was a garrison town, and he said that even in the post-war period, veterans who had served in the local IRA brigade, as well as Irish veterans who'd served in Irish regiments during the First War, or British regiments during the First World War, great war veterans, that basically the Great War veterans would parade to the Zenithaf in Tullamore. So there was a war memorial in the heart of the town. And after the 11 o'clock service, basically they would go to the local British Legion Club. There were British Legion clubs right around the country. And the old IRA men would go in with the Great War veterans and they'd have a drink together in the British Legion Club. And there was no animosity. There was, he actually said, and I don't think it was accurate for every part of Ireland, but he said in the Tullamore that he grew up in, there was no vestiges of anti-British consciousness at all, or as far as he could remember. They were able to balance both forms of commemoration, both for veterans who had fought for Irish independence against Crown forces, as well as veterans who'd fought for the Crown in the First World War on the Western Front and in other theatres. But anyway, I wanted to move on to the next question, which is to do with Northern Ireland. So we have Jim O'Neill, who is not representing the Northern Ireland War Memorial, but is here in a personal capacity. But I wonder if I might be so cheeky, Jim, given the fact that you do work for the Northern Ireland War Memorial, as to ask you, what was Northern Ireland's experience during the Second World War, broadly speaking?
Well, by the way, happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone. Who's having a great time. One of the first things that actually springs to mind is people sometimes look at you and go, was Northern Ireland really in it? Like, no, what? It's not really something that springs to mind. But it had some key things and some key differences that sets it aside. One is partition, obviously. It's one of the 6 counties of Ireland that remained in the United Kingdom. But what set it apart from Britain was that, one, it had a land border with a ostensibly neutral country, that was Ireland. It also didn't have conscription, which was unlike Britain. Everyone that came from Northern Ireland was a volunteer, much as the ones that came from the south. But also, what set it apart, it was a centre of industry, and it's what made it one of the key, most important aspects of Northern Ireland in the Second World War. A lot of that industry was centred in Belfast. You had Short Brothers and Harland, the shipyards. If you can get an idea of the importance of the shipyards, I think it constructed something like 130 warships during the war, and I think something similar amount of freighters. It also had one of the largest rope works in the British Empire. During the war years, it constructed something like 250,000 tons of rope. That's roughly about a quarter of all the cordage used by the Royal Navy was manufactured in Belfast. It had foundries. Mackey's Foundry was one of the major producers of 40mm Beaufort shells. I think roughly 75 million were produced during the war, which is a lot of Beaufort shells. And also shirt factories up in Derry. A huge amount of the uniforms worn by the British military during the war were manufactured up in Derry. So it was a massive manufacturing base that perhaps doesn't go quite recognised, but certainly for one thing, the Germans recognised it. And even though, because of its position on the western fringe of Europe, a lot of people thought it's okay. The war will never come here. Any number of reasons to delude themselves. They thought the war wouldn't come here because it was too far away. There was better targets in Britain, or the defences in Britain actually would protect Northern Ireland. Even some thought that Eamon de Valera's declaration of neutrality would actually protect them. In the end, in 1941, the Germans did find their way to Belfast, and in 4 raids, 2 major raids, they killed almost 1,000 people in one night, Easter Tuesday, 1941. It was 15th to 16th of April. There was upwards of 740 people killed in one raid, which is one of the largest out of single night casualty figures in the UK outside London. And often Belfast doesn't even appear in the pantheon of the stories of the Blitz over Britain. This, of course, came as a huge shock. The whole idea of this Blitz spirit and we can take it is nonsense, absolute nonsense manufacturing. It was seen in Belfast that there was morale was very severely dented by these huge losses and disruption, and even the shipyards and the aircraft factories was manufactured short Sunderlands, which was one of the major flying boats used to try and close the air gap in the Battle of the Atlantic. They didn't actually return till manufacturing pre-raid manufacturing until the next year. So it was very very severely hit. But after this war, Northern Ireland comes in is when the Americans joined the war after Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. The first Americans to land in Europe landed in Belfast, 26th of January 1942. A guy called Milburn Henke was the official first GI to land, and he was quite the celebrity. But he was the first of 300,000 Americans to come through. That's of all services. That's Marines, Navy, Army, and Army Air Force that were stationed in Northern Ireland throughout the war. Because he travelled here either for training. There were something like 6 air bases handed over to the U.S. Army Air Force for use as combat crew replacement centres throughout the war, which was training crews up to work as a team and how to fly in. As you might imagine, American crews had been taught to fly in America, which is the weather is significantly better than the weather here. So they were taught how to operate as a crew effectively in more European weather before getting sent off to their operational bases in Britain and then on to Europe. Derry was one of these most important escort bases in the Battle of the Atlantic. Initially, the U.S. naval base that was built there, Base 1, Derry, that was the largest U.S. naval operating base in the European theatre. But eventually they changed it where the Americans started looking after the other side of the Atlantic, and the British and the Canadians looked after this side of the Atlantic. But it was still a hugely important operating base, escort base throughout the war. And Belfast itself was an assembly area for convoys, for merchant navy convoys. So its role, while often overlooked, was hugely important, and certainly for things like the one pivotal battle that couldn't be lost during the Second World War, say the Battle of the Atlantic. Northern Ireland had a significant role to play in that. And then, of course, when you get to D-Day, you see part of the bombardment fleet was assembled in Belfast Lough, and then almost overnight, once you see D-Day, you have American troops not going on D-Day, but going on the follow-up waves, then transited from Northern Ireland. So almost overnight, the Americans sort of vanish from 1944, and then you have 1944 and the rundown from the rest of the war. So, like everywhere else, Northern Ireland had its role to play.
Do you think, Jim, that Northern Ireland's experience of the war needs to be viewed in isolation from the wider Irish experience of the Second World War? Do you think it's something, because we are talking about, in some respects, a separate society, and they are in the war in a way that Southern Ireland is not? Is it do you think that there's cause for an integrated narrative about the general island-wide experience of war? Do you think, would you adhere to the idea, as do many historians of Northern Ireland during the Second World War, that it's an experience that needs to be considered in isolation from the wider Irish experience?
Oh, no. To view it in isolation, to try and sequester it off as some sort of separate experience, as if history was defined, that history stopped at the border. It did not at all. And there was relations throughout the war. Smuggling was a huge industry. Smuggling was almost like par for the course. The whole idea of troops not being allowed, officially, troops weren't allowed to cross the border, but actually it happened all the time. And certainly where you have cooperation, the level of cooperation that, of course, certainly wasn't recognized at the time, but was known. Things like Coastal Command and the operation of, say, like the famous Donegal corridor, which was a corridor opened up by the De Valera government to allow the transit of escort or aircraft from
the flying boats. So just to give a sort of a wider kind of just to map this out for any listeners or viewers who are unfamiliar with the territorial layout. So these flying boats took off from a lake called Lough Erne, which is in County Fermanagh, and this is a landlocked lake, and it's landlocked by Northern Irish, like UK territory, as well as Republic, not Republic of Ireland. It wasn't a republic at the time. Free State or Independent Ireland territory, neutral Irish territory. So essentially, you have Donegal on one side of the lake, and you've got UK Fermanagh on the other side. And essentially, these flying boats, when they take off, in order to reach the Atlantic, they have to fly over Donegal, which is it's neutral Irish territory. The Irish government, so what Jim is referring to here, for the benefit, Jim, sorry, indulge me here, for the benefit of those who are listening who are not familiar with the territorial layout, the Donegal corridor, the air corridor, is essentially a flight path over neutral territory, which the Irish government permits the British government to use for the benefit of basically the RAF operating anti-submarine patrols in order to close the air gap, to assist the convoy escorts in essentially in their anti-submarine duties, to basically add that extra punch in terms of fighting the Kriegsmarine, fighting the U-boats. And it's particularly significant to have that air corridor for the Catalina. These are US supplied Catalina flying boats. They're not the RAF short Sunderlands, because they are too large. They take too long to take off. The Catalinas are perfectly positioned to basically take off from that lake, but they've got very little mileage in which to do it. If they don't take off within a certain stretch, they'll crash into the far bank, and that does happen on a couple of occasions. But these anti-submarine patrols that take off from Lough Erne are absolutely vital to ultimately winning victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. Without the Donegal corridor, it's very difficult to know how the British would have been able to do it. There's not much the Irish would have been able to do to stop these anti-submarine patrols from taking off from Northern Ireland and crossing their territory. But the fact that the government conceded that the British could use it was one of a number of aspects of neutral Irish wartime cooperation that is significant. I think also the way, Jim, I just wanted to come in with you with regard to the impact of the Belfast Blitz. Not enough has been written about the impact that the Blitz had on the South. It's been more about the North, disaffection with the Unionist government, the Unionist-dominated government that are, a lot of them are very geriatric. They're very old. Some of them are considered to be unfit for office, and they are considered to be completely out of their depth in terms of wartime leadership. So, in your opinion, what was the most significant impact of the Belfast Blitz in terms of the North's relationship with the South? And we'll move on to another subject.
I think one of the lasting elements that certainly we would commemorate in the museum was the fact that in the Belfast Blitz, one, it was actually a huge source of misinformation. We'll get to that later. But one of the main things that you should remember and should look at it was the cooperation that it fostered between the North and the South. There was 4 raids, but the second Easter Tuesday raid was one that caused the most casualties. It was devastating because of the poor weather. The German Pathfinders had marked the high density housing in North Belfast instead of the docks that got absolutely pounded and totally overwhelmed the emergency services. And a telegram was sent to that phone call was made to the South asking for assistance. The assistance was approved by De Valera and volunteers were asked for, and 75 firefighters volunteered from Dublin, Dunleary, Dundalk and Drogheda, and they went up in 13 fire engines. And people say, oh, they're just up to fight fires. When they went up, by the time they arrived at about 9 o'clock in the morning, there's still bombs going off because roughly 10% were time delayed bombs. So this is still hugely dangerous. And these guys volunteered for this, and they went up and fought all day, fires and rescue, and amongst this carnage. But then they were withdrawn about 8 o'clock in the evening but the last of them were gone by 8 o'clock because they couldn't have. There was next major raid because the Germans came back because they knew that even though they caused a huge amount of damage, they hadn't hit the targets they were looking for. The fire crews in the South didn't wait. They could actually see the glow from Belfast, and there's 130 volunteered this time, and came up in fire engines and ambulances and did the exact same thing and served, and then went back in the day. So, and this was greatly appreciated. And the fact is that when there was the North Strand bombing in Dublin, to reciprocate, the offer was sent to the south that they would send fire engines. Of course, it wasn't required, but the fact was that the relationships were made, and they weren't they weren't ignoring each other's needs. You know what I mean? There was appreciation of the effort.
Good. Now, I'm just going to briefly pause the show because we've had an arrival. So I'd like you guys to introduce Ronan McGreevy of the Irish Times. Ronan, just to let you know, you're muted. So if you want to speak, just be sure to. We regularly make this mistake all the time on the show. We start talking without unmuting ourselves, and basically it's all picture and no sound. So Ronan, you're very welcome to the show, and we're
Thanks very much for having me. Happy St. Patrick's Day to all concerned.
Happy St. Patrick's Day to you as well. So Ronan McGreevy, for everybody, Ronan McGreevy is a journalist with the Irish Times newspaper, which is, I think it's fair to say, the premier newspaper in the Republic of Ireland and one of the top publications throughout the island of Ireland. So it's our version of the Times of London. But anyway, we are just coming to the very controversial, meaty topic. So we've gotten past talking about a lot of the issues around service in the British forces, Irish service in the British forces. Jim O'Neill has just guided us through the experience of Northern Ireland during the Second World War. So what we're going to move to now is a discussion of neutrality. So this is a question for all of you, and I'm going to start with you, Ronan. Why was Southern Ireland neutral during the Second World War, to your mind, as briefly as possible?
Well, the first reason was because we weren't invaded. And if you look at the start of the Second World War, every small country did not declare their neutrality at the start, but all their neutrality was disregarded by Germany. So we're talking about Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway. These countries were all neutral in the Second World War, at the beginning of the Second World War, but their neutrality was violated by Germany. Ours wasn't, fortunately. That's the first reason. The second reason is because of partition. De Valera's government felt that Ireland could not have any part in the Second World War while Ireland was partitioned. That was a very strongly held view at the time. The third reason is because the state was only at that stage 17 years in existence, still really trying to find its feet in the world. The memory of the Civil War was still there in a very major way. It had only ended in 1923, and neutrality was popular with all strands of Irish society, with the exception of one Fine Gael politician whose name just escapes me at the moment. His father was the head of he was the last leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party. It'll come to me, but
James Dillon.
Yeah, he was the only one who spoke out against it. So for those three reasons, I think that those were the reasons why Ireland was neutral. But I think the main reason, and I need to stress this again, was because we weren't invaded. So therefore, our neutrality was never violated.
Thank you very much, Ronan. That's a very good answer. Yeah, in recent times, Ireland's neutrality has been hotly contested online, and we're going to get onto this in a little bit now. Jim O'Neill has been in the trenches for quite some time on this, so we're going to come to the golden question about, was Irish neutrality justified in a little bit, and we'll get into all the various different things that shall we say all the heroic tales of basically Irish scholars and defenders of the legacy of Irish neutrality wading out into the Colosseum of Twitter and so on and so forth to defend Ireland's honour. I suppose I want to go, because I haven't spoken to you in a while, Peter. So, Peter, have you any views on this coming, I suppose, from a British or UK perspective? Would you say that there's any merit to British feelings or feelings of people in the UK who are a bit down on Irish neutrality or non-participation? Do you think their feelings are in any way justified? Or what is at the root of the persistence of the sort of the people who decry neutrality, and what to your mind are the key reasons why Ireland remain neutral?
I'm reluctant to get into any discussion of justification, of whether it was justified. I'm not going to get into that. What I can say is that Britain was at war, the Commonwealth was at war, lots of people were at war, Ireland wasn't. What I can say, having worked at the Royal Air Force Museum and having worked in this sphere for a long time, by definition, I'm focusing on those who served in the British Armed Forces, the United States Armed Forces. So I would leave that to those. I can see the arguments on both sides. The fault lines that were exposed in Irish society from 1914 through to 1939 were very real. The wounds were very raw, and it's entirely understandable. I've heard people that I've respected and liked expressing views that were diametrically opposed on this. And as I say, it's not something I'm going to get involved in. What I will say is that the people I focused on did a very good job. They felt that they were doing the right thing. Some of them were persecuted when they returned home. That was been after 2012. That was something I personally find repulsive. But what I'm going to say is it's not something that I can pontificate on and judge. I wasn't there. My grandfather made his decision. He didn't judge anybody else for staying at home, and nor would he concede that he had done anything wrong at all. He did it for entirely moral reasons. He was a married man with a good job. He didn't have to go. He chose to go.
Peter, that's a very good answer, and that's fair enough. I mean, one of the things I would say that with regard to the legacy of neutrality is that it's very complex in the Irish case, which brings me to Stephen. I wanted to ask you, Stephen, one of the things that I'm sure you encountered and I encountered as well is with regard to those who volunteered for the British forces from Ireland, both particularly from the south, because obviously this was something that was more pertinent to people from the south, given the fact that the south is neutral. There seemed to be almost a duality. So the duality was that basically those who chose to fight for Britain supported the cause for which Britain was fighting the war and the Allies were fighting the war. But there was quite a large proportion that still supported neutrality. So there was a duality of view, being both pro-Allied and pro-neutral. Would you be able to shed any light on why this was the case? Or?
Yeah, well, I'll start by going back to why was Ireland neutral. I think there's some other reasons that have not been mentioned yet that need to be mentioned. We need to remember the context of the 1930s. De Valera got elected on a mandate of dismantling the Anglo-Irish Treaty, removing parts of the Irish Free State Constitution that he found, unpleasant. So he was able to have his constitution passed in 1937 by referendum, which changed the name of the country to ERA. Removed any reference to the British King as the head of the Irish Free State, along with a lot of other symbolic gestures to try to dismantle the Anglo-Irish Treaty, demonstrate that Ireland was an independent and sovereign country. And so there's a logical connection between wanting to do that, demonstrate that Ireland's an independent country, and deciding to remain neutral in September 1939, when Britain declares war and the other dominions declare war as well. Although I would mention that South Africa was a very close run thing. I mean, they had a vote in their parliament, and it was a very narrow margin between those who wanted to stay out of the war and those that voted to declare war. And that's obviously because of the complicated history in that country, with the Afrikaner population being a lot less enthusiastic about supporting Britain's causes than the English-speaking South Africans. So the logical, it was quite logical that De Valera would want to declare neutrality to demonstrate once again that Ireland is an independent country that makes its own decisions. But there are two other reasons that I find very compelling for Ireland to remain neutral. One is that the country was defenseless, thanks to numerous Irish governments during the interwar years not spending sufficient money on the Irish Defence Forces. They lacked every type of modern equipment that you can name. They didn't have enough anti-aircraft guns. They didn't have any kind of tanks. They didn't have enough mechanical transport, fighter aircraft. All the modern means of defending your country were completely lacking in Ireland because of that policy during the interwar years. So Ireland was defenseless, and you could just say that it would have been grossly irresponsible, in fact, to come into the war in that condition, in that vulnerable state, that Ireland would have been a very easy target for the Luftwaffe, for example. And the third reason, another reason that I find compelling for Ireland to stay out of the war was the fact that there was a danger of a civil war starting. I mean, it was only, we had a civil war in 1922 to 1923 over the connection to Britain, over the fact whether should Ireland be a completely independent republic, should it continue being part of the British Empire. So it's perfectly feasible to see another civil war breaking out if De Valera had actually decided to join Britain and declare war. The IRA was still in existence, and who knows who else other than the IRA would have got involved if Ireland had joined the war. So again, it seems like a wise and responsible decision from a security point of view to stay neutral. But what do we mean when we say neutral? Because we have this expression benevolent neutrality, and we've been talking about the fact that Irish people were freely able to go to Northern Ireland, go to Britain, and join the British forces. So we're not talking about some kind of strict neutrality like Switzerland, where it was illegal to join a foreign army. We're talking about a very flexible, very pro-British form of neutrality. And it could be argued that it was more beneficial to Britain than Ireland being in the war. Although I do acknowledge in the early part of the war, the treaty ports, the naval ports in the south of Ireland possibly could have been very useful to Britain in the Battle of the Atlantic. But separately from that, you had many benefits that Ireland provided to Britain to try to show Britain that Ireland's neutrality was not against Britain, was not a way to hurt Britain. So allowing Irish people to join the British forces, secret forms of cooperation, there was exchange of intelligence before D-Day, giving vital weather reports to the British that were needed to decide whether they could go ahead with the D-Day landings. Many different forms of cooperation. You've mentioned the Donegal corridor earlier. And that's what I would say about that. In terms of the duality, I don't see any contradiction between, as an Irish person in the British forces, believing that them joining the British forces to fight in the war, and at the same time saying Ireland has the right to stay out of this, to stay neutral. I don't see a contradiction. I believe they did have a dual identity, as you put it. Yeah, that they were Irish. But they also identified perhaps as part of this greater British and Irish identity, and they believed personally that they wanted to be involved in the war. But they understood the history of Ireland, the recent history of Ireland, the complicated history with Britain, not just the War of Independence, but there had been an economic war in the 1930s as well. Let's not forget that. And they understood that it was perfectly logical that that Ireland wanted to remain neutral, at least benevolently neutral. That was completely understandable given the circumstances just before the Second World War.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I mean, I couldn't have put it better myself, really and truly. Particularly, and the most compelling argument from my point of view is the threat of civil war. And when you mention this, I think to a UK audience, I think they just sort of don't, and it's not their fault, I think they just sort of don't believe it, that a civil war would have been, a renewed civil war would have been a realistic prospect. But this was the justification that De Valera gave. He gave it time and time again. But the truth about it was this was a a very fractured society. The party political division within Ireland was along Civil War lines. Our equivalent of the Tory party and the Labour Party or Liberal Party, but we had Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. They used to be part of the one political party, which was Sinn Féin, and they split along Civil War lines. And there was a Godwin's law within Dáil Éireann, which was very loosely applied. Don't mention the Civil War because the business of the house would break down. When power was handed over to De Valera, incidentally, and I think it's an important point to make, I just want to move Eddie to the slide about De Valera, because I want to move on to De Valera's input and his legacy and all of this. When it came to basically De Valera taking power in 1932, so we had a provisional government which during and in the aftermath of the Civil War established the state. It had 50,000 Irish soldiers, which more or less imposed effectively kind of like a martial government, which had been democratically elected, but it had to be enforced by force of arms due to military resistance. And De Valera essentially took power in 1932, having backed the anti-treaty side. And this was a very tense moment. It was a test case for whether Irish democracy would work under pressure. And De Valera and his delegates, Fianna Fáil delegates, when they entered Dáil Éireann, they did so with pistols in their pockets. That's how close things were to basically getting very much out of control in Southern Ireland at that particular time. And there was too much of a risk. There were too few benefits and too many risks involved in committing Ireland to the Allied cause, very regrettably, during the Second World War, in my view. Some others may disagree, but this leads us to the key question, because the person who oversaw not the inception of neutral policy had been chosen by the previous government, but shall we say the enforcement or the inaction of neutrality was none other than Eamon De Valera, who had been part of the 1916 Rising insurrection. He had been the one leading figure within the leadership of the 1916 Rising who hadn't been executed by merit of the fact that he was an American citizen. And he was the person who became Taoiseach of Ireland, or Prime Minister, and oversaw neutral policy. However, he had to balance things. And this leads me to the question about De Valera's attitude towards Irish participation in the war. And I want to go directly to Ronan on this, because Ronan has a forthcoming book, which is a book that he helped edit, which is a memoir, a lost memoir of Sean Lemass. It's based on interviews that were recorded by somebody who intended to write a biography of Sean Lemass, and unfortunately didn't get around to it. So Ronan McGreevy has completed the job. So this is the lost memoir of Sean Lemass. And for those of you who are unaware who Sean Lemass is, Sean Lemass was Minister of Supplies in De Valera's government during the Second World War. There was rationing in Ireland, as there was with many European countries and wartime nations. And Lemass was a junior minister who was perhaps a little bit pro-Allied and was a very interesting fly in the wall during that particular period. So, Ronan, what's your view about De Valera's legacy as a sort of if you like, a wartime leader, and his views on participation in the war? What did Lemass have to say about this in his memoir, and what are your views on this?
Well, first of all, Lemass felt that the 1938 Anglo-Irish Agreement, which gave the 3 treaty ports back to Ireland, there's Bearhaven Cove and Lough Swilly, was something that ensured Ireland's neutrality in the Second World War. It was done. It was done despite the opposition of Winston Churchill. Churchill was the only one who, the only politician, British politician I'm aware of, who was against the handover of the treaty. So that allowed Ireland to be as well. I don't know what would have happened if Britain still had the treaty ports. I have no idea. I mean, it's counterfactual history. In terms of De Valera was adamant from the very beginning of the war that Ireland was going to be neutral. I mean, he said that on the 3rd of September, the day that Great Britain declared war on Germany, and he was entirely consistent about that view throughout the war. There was he came under ferocious pressure, as you may already have spoken about, in 1940 and 41 during the Battle of the Atlantic. At one stage, Churchill allegedly offered an end to partition at the end of the war in return for Ireland's participation in it. De Valera didn't take the bait. He didn't trust the British enough to make a commitment like that. But once the sort of the emergency, I suppose, of the Atlantic War kind of passed around 1942, De Valera sort of settled into the position in neutrality. It was something that he was actually absolutely punctilious about from right up until the end of the war, until, of course, that notorious visit to Edward Hempel at the end of the war. That was part of his thinking, that we're going to remain neutral no matter what, and we will do things. His visit to Hempel was in that regard. He felt that he didn't want to add to Hempel's sort of humiliation when his country was beaten. Obviously, that visit is very, very controversial, but I think it's only mischievous individuals that would suggest that somehow that made De Valera pro-German. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. In fact, he was not pro-German, as some of your other speakers have said. That's
yes. Yes. I was just
good timing, huh?
Did you? Is his name Dev? So yeah. Well, I think with regard to the visit to Herr Hempel, this is the thing. There are two things that seem to pop up very strongly in terms of the controversies around neutrality. So one is the way in which the Irish government treated Irish Army deserters who left ostensibly to join the British forces, who essentially they deserted, particularly in the early years of the war, and began to tail off towards the end. But there was an epidemic of desertion, particularly between 41 and 42. You had 2,700 desertions from the Irish Defence Forces, mainly from the Army. And they weren't even counting the number of Irish Army, like the equivalent of the reserve. The Irish had the equivalent of Home Guard battalions. And there was a drift basically to the British Army. So the two episodes that are basically considered to be controversial are how we handled the desertions problem at the end of the Second World War, and also De Valera's visit to Herr Hempel, who was the German representative to Ireland, in terms of the giving of condolences. This has plagued Ireland ever since in terms of the war. Neutrality was bad enough, but it's essentially it's essentially cast what I would call a pall of shame over the whole legacy of neutrality, which I would argue was otherwise flawlessly executed. I mean, does anybody, like Jim, do you have any thoughts on this?
Especially when it comes to the whole, like, the pall of shame, like, and the whole, the misrepresentation of the visit to Hempel is one thing, but this whole pall of shame, like, Ireland sat it out. And to be honest, if you actually start to look at it and you see the level of cooperation, like, De Valera was constantly in public saying about the requirement of neutrality, but in the background was clearly being anything but neutral. And then when you actually start to look at it as a whole by the end of the war, precisely how much more would the allies of Britain have got from Ireland that they weren't already getting? They were getting manpower, they were getting supplies and food shipments. Any surpluses Ireland had was going across to Britain. They were getting access to the Atlantic. The port of Derry was performing a function far greater usefulness than any of the treaty ports ever would have. So the question remains, what extra could have been provided? What difference would it have made that wasn't already being given? And as far as I can see, very little. So that whole idea of sitting on its hands, I don't think that holds any water at all. The rest with De Valera and the visit to Hempel, again, as we said, is mischievous because it doesn't take too much looking at it to realize what it was. There's the whole element of the US envoy Grey as well. Apparently, the British representative Maffei considered this was basically De Valera taking a shot across Grey's bows because Grey had been anything but diplomatic in the weeks beforehand. So yeah, this whole Polish shame, it's a manufactured guilt, and I really don't see any grounds for it at all. I certainly in what's your guy's first name? The guy Kelly did the book on Coming Home. The
Bernard Kelly.
Bernard Kelly. That's it. Looking at the experiences of those that did return after serving with the British, and again, the vast majority of them weren't deserters. The vast majority of them were just guys that went, served, and came back, and didn't experience anything like, or certainly in Kelly's book doesn't suggest anything like this is this systematic or government abuse that people might suggest. So I don't think it holds any water. When you shine any sort of light on it, it's shadows. There's nothing really there.
Well, thanks very much. So I wanted to get into just a few comments and questions, and I'm just going to go to the last question of this discussion. I think we might have lost Stephen. I think Stephen might have had to leave. I'm not too sure. He might have had to go. So Stephen is lecturer at the Sorbonne. For those of you who joined before I made the introduction, lecturer in modern British history at the Sorbonne, and he was mainly talking about the experience of the Irish and the British forces. So a number of questions came in. So Sean O'Keefe has been making quite a lot of comments. So there's Jack Hart's To the Limit of Endurance, brilliant book. So Jack Hart was he was a Labour senator who actually knew Yasser Arafat personally, and he wrote a book about his experiences. He served in the British Army during the war in the Royal Irish Fusiliers and was captured in Leros and was a prisoner of war. Sean O'Keefe asked a question which I was going to ask. Actually, I was going to ask Stephen. Does Adrian Carton de Wart or de Wart count as Irish? Because he has a sort of an Anglo-Dutch, Belgian-Irish kind of composition. He's been recently labelled by some big fitness, self-confidence guru who has one of these big YouTube channels as being the ultimate example of what it is to be a man. Like a proper man, because of sort of his bravado and whatnot. I don't know whether I'm going to answer that question, Sean. I'm not entirely certain whether he would. He's definitely got strong Irish connections, but I'm not entirely certain. I think at the very most possibly 50% Irish, but he's definitely got enough European origins to justify being called as much Belgian as Irish. De Valera. So. There's a lot of things here. De Valera's remarks with regard to the Belfast splits, they are still our people. Their suffering is our suffering. So this is De Valera's speech at Westport in the aftermath of the bombing of Belfast on the Easter Tuesday, 16th of April, which followed from the 25th anniversary of the 1916 commemoration. Irish Army deserters, according to Sean O'Keefe, were banned from serving in the civil service for a period of 7 years for desertion. It's hardly persecution compared to penalties in other countries. This is a very strong point. I mean, Roland, do you have any comment on the desertions controversy with regard to how the Irish government handled that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I look. I mean, yeah, I think there's a lot of retrospective sort of shaming of Ireland in relation to this. I don't think any other country would have treated them differently. You know, I mean, I mean, there are penalties in any army for desertion. That being said, I think retrospectively speaking, Alan Shatter was right to offer them. I think he offered them a pardon in 2011, if I'm not mistaken. But I just don't think any other country would have acted any differently. Now, your other two guests may have a different view on that, but at the time, you know, to desert an army in wartime is a serious thing, even if you're doing it for the right reasons, which they obviously were.
Yeah, Ronan. So what I was just going to say was there were other points that were made. Aidan O'Sullivan said, "I think it's possible to have complex thoughts on this. I can understand the Irish desire for neutrality. My grandfather was in the IRA and took to anti-treaty side and sustained lifelong injuries. His view is it's possible to understand it and see why and regret it too. It's possible to be proud of Irish who served with the Allies and to understand those who didn't." I would broadly agree with that point. But he actually asked a very interesting question. Worth a counterfactual historical experiment. What would have happened if Ireland had been a belligerent?
It's complex and it's nuanced. I think the last comment that was made is pretty much on the nail. You can look at it more than one way. And as I keep going back to my grandfather, again, I met him twice ever, but I know what he was like as a man. And he chose to go. I'm unaware of him ever criticizing anybody that didn't go, but nor would he concede on that.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. I think I'm just going to field one last question I'm going to go to Jim with regard to, and also Ronan, if I can get your sound back, I'd like you to come in on this as well, just sort of as a concluding point. So Jim O'Neill is in his personal capacity as an historian and not views his own, not representative of the Northern Ireland War Memorial, has been wading in for quite a long time on stuff that has been coming up on social media with regard to Ireland's wartime neutrality and all the stuff that, you know, sort of De Valera's visit to the German representative, signing the book of condolences. Ronan, I'd like you to come in on this point because you wrote a piece about the book of condolences, and I'd like you to sort of fix the record on this. But everything from basically every suggestion under the sun made with regard to Ireland's position in this conflict, essentially ignoring all the pro-Allied cooperation and making Ireland out to have basically been pro-German or pro-Nazi. The question I have for you, Jim, is what are the implications of essentially this, what I would refer to as anti-Irish propaganda, which has been circulated on social media, this disinformation, which seems to be getting more and more voluminous by the day, and is being pushed by, I would describe them as nefarious actors, very often not putting their actual names to their social media accounts. What are the implications of this, shall we say, this anti-Irish misinformation been promulgated to this level? Do you think that there are potentially serious consequences down the line? Do you think this has the possibility? Are these just cranks, or do you think that it might have serious damage down the line? And what are the political factors that might be driving it modern day when we look at the current, shall we say, current affairs, the current state of the world?
Initially, when I first saw it, I didn't really pay that much attention. I first came to my attention a few years ago in context with the Belfast Blitz. It was that people started putting about, again, like I say, normally anonymous types on Twitter, and started talking about the IRA or the Irish marking the way to Belfast with lights, or the Irish, though the good one, the Irish in Dublin leaving their lights on to guide German bombers, that sort of carry on. And then it's all refueling you, it's all nonsense like that, all easily refuted by evidence. But the problem is that these sort of types, or this sort of tide, which it definitely is, that it almost comes in a wave form, it comes in waves, is evidence resistant. It doesn't matter how much evidence you present, it doesn't really have any effect. It doesn't change the narrative as this, and it is a narrative that they try to create. And I'm not saying they as if they're guided or that's getting some conspiratorial thing, but what I am saying is that this gets picked up by people who are normally respectable in certain circles, respectable politicians, semi-respectable, certainly renowned historians can pick it up or and proselytize this and promote it. It actually creates attraction that surprised me, but it does gain traction, and its effect over time is that the narrative becomes real in people's heads. It's a bit like the whole the lights to guide bombers is absolutely fact in some people's heads because it's never been pushed back on and never been shown to be wrong. But it isn't difficult to show that it's wrong. But I think that this narrative over time, and definitely in the current political situation, certainly where you see major waves of this come, say when you have something like Ireland, the Irish government is critical of the policies of Israel and actions in the Middle East. You see a sudden spike in this, it almost as night follows day. So there is a connection, and there is a reason for this to happen. And the more you see it, and the more you see it linked to modern day politics, the more it's worrying. As there is, I used to think that they wouldn't be doing it on social media if it didn't have an effect, and to see it linked so closely to modern day politics is worrying. And that's why you can't leave, almost like leaving the garden untended. You have to push back, otherwise it gains a momentum of its own.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You're in the trenches really on this one, man. And I was involved in. I don't really get involved in this stuff that much, but I was involved in some torrid exchanges.
See how caustic it gets really quickly. Really quickly, it gets really bitter.
I had somebody basically send me. This is somebody who described themselves as a West Brit Dalkeyite, who basically sent me a Chris Pratt meme of basically the meme of Chris Pratt basically winding up his middle finger at me. So it's.
I had someone phone my work. Someone phoned my work and tried to call me an IRA apologist and all this thing. Tries to get trouble in real life. It's beyond just like the ephemeral world of online.
Can I pitch in at this point? I want to say thank you to Mr. Devitt and Stephen for being on, and they've obviously gone because they've got an alternative life. I want to thank everybody here, but I just want to make a comment on my behalf because I'm like Mr. Devitt. I was born in London. My family, a potato famine Irish, so they came over in 1849. So I was raised in a family which was essentially, saw itself as British, but Catholic background. But my father was a conscript, called up, put in London Irish Rifles in the Irish Brigade, I think everyone knows that, and served very proudly in the Irish Brigade as a conscript. And he was aware of his Irish heritage, but this gave an extra boost to his sense of who he was. And I think on a positive note, to finish this conversation, is on the 12th of June 1944, my father, 150 members of the Irish Brigade, and these were soldiers who were in the main born in Ireland, some of them of Irish descent, and my dad. They were Catholics and Protestants. They were from North and South. They were from Northern Ireland and from Ireland. And they came together for the first audience granted to Allied troops by the Pope in the Vatican. And great enthusiasm was there. My father went as a good Catholic boy from London. But in the ranks of those who were in the Apostolic Palace that day on the 12th of June 1944, when the Pope came in at 9 o'clock in the morning, was at least one member of the Orange Order, one proudly wearing his sash, and always celebrate this moment. And I've often thought that this moment on 12th June 1944 was one of the highest expressions of Irish unity and possibly Irish history, but certainly evidence that the contribution that the people of Ireland made, that's men who served in the armed forces, their families, their family members, the people who served in the industries and the Air Force and everything else, was a real expression, I think, of the contribution that the people of Ireland and people of Irish ancestry made to the victory in 1945, the restoration of democracy in most of Western Europe, and of course to almost more than 80 years of almost unbroken peace challenged at present in Europe. And I've often felt that this is a great opportunity. So when I was looking to get some attention to this moment, I thought it's a great moment for Ireland, the people of Ireland, and anybody who feels Irish, to celebrate the contribution that Ireland made, the people of Ireland made to 1945. This is a great moment to bring people together. So I first approached the Irish Embassy in Rome, and I said, any opportunity to celebrate this great moment of Irish, being Irish and the Irish contribution to the victory. And the ambassador read out a statement received from the Foreign Ministry saying, well, Ireland was neutral in the Second World War, therefore does not want to be associated with any commemoration that would align Ireland with either side or any side in the Second World War. So we suggest if you want to do something, go to the British Embassy, which I did. And the British, in their own way, decided that, yes, great. So they were the ones who organised that on the 80th anniversary of this historic moment at 9 o'clock in the morning on the 9th of June. So it was 80 years to the minute that my dad and his comrades were in the Vatican, we were there with not only a dozen representatives from Ireland and the veterans, but the Irish band from the Royal Irish Regiment marched into St. Peter's Square in this wonderful celebration. It was one of the most moving moments of my life. It was an opportunity for me with my family members, my wife and my son, to stand there and think about my mum and dad and all his brothers and sisters, including, for my father, 4 members of his family who were in the armed forces, 1 in the RAF, 2 in the RAF, 1 in the Royal Navy, 1 in the Merchant Marine, my father an infantryman. And all the men that my father served with in the Irish Brigade, many of them from the island of Ireland, North and South, Catholic and Protestant. And it was a great moment. So I think the question, I suppose, the closing question I put to you all, and you will have a go at this. I'm personally very engaged in the process of memorialising the Second World War. I see it as not only a great moment for the United Kingdom, a moment that unified the nation. It was a noble cause and we won. That's the United Kingdom. But it was also a great moment for all the nations of the archipelago, including Ireland. And it seems to me only fair that the people of Ireland should have the opportunity to celebrate the contribution that their country and their society made to the victory in 1945, which to a certain extent has been denied. So when you have the annual commemorations, they're all there. Russia's there, Brazil's there. Saudi Arabia can claim the role, declared war against. But it seems that the Ireland as a people, as a country, has been denied that right. So looking forward, how do you feel is the right approach to engage Ireland and the Irish people and the island of Ireland and Irish people everywhere in celebrating the role of the Irish people, whether they were born in Ireland or born in Britain or of Irish descent in America and Australia and New Zealand, every formation that you look at who played a role in the Second World War, every single formation, I mean, the number of Irish names just leaps out at you. People whose parents were born, they might have been born in Ireland and migrated to America or Australia, but their parents or their grandparents, they leap out at you. So what do you think is the right approach to engage today's generation and future generations, ensuring that the contribution made by the island of Ireland, in all its parts, to this seminal moment in European and world history?
I think, I don't know if you'd agree with me, Ronan, but I think the Irish government's default position, because Leo Varadkar, when he launched the biography of De Valera by David McCullough a number of years ago, Leo Varadkar very strongly declared, and he was representing the political party that would have opposed De Valera traditionally, when he launched the book for David McCullough, the 2-volume biography of De Valera, he said very resolutely that neutrality had been the right decision. And if the Irish government and if, Irish society clings to basically this whole idea that neutrality was the right policy, which I think, actually, I think neutrality was the right policy. I think I could speak for Ronan by saying it was the right call. Stephen has gone on the record and said that he feels it was, and he outlined very compelling reasons why it was the right policy. And I'm not too sure, Jim, I'm not going to speak on your behalf, but I'm going to assume that you probably favoured neutral policy as well. If the Irish government sticks to that line, if the Irish political establishment stick to it, then I don't think a celebration of victory in 1945 on the centenary in 2045 is going to be possible for the Irish people. I just don't think. What do you think, Jim?
Like everything else in history, it's complex. I totally agree with you. It's personally, you'd never think it online, but I'm not and never have been a big fan of Dev. He's quite a contentious figure to say the least. But one thing was right is that he did what was best and did what was best for the country at a massively difficult time, a time the tumultuous time for the entire world. Um, how you square that circle after the fact, where you can see the impact Ireland did, but what the line it officially chose, that can be difficult. Where I'd have any answer, would I have an answer for it? I'm not quite sure I would, because it is a difficult history. All it really is to present all the information as make it as available as possible. Do not, and like I said, like as you said with many of the service personnel, you can't have dichotomy. No, no, you can hold the opinion that it was right to join, but it was also right for other people not to. You can't hold those same, and the service personnel held those opinions. So yes, it is a difficult history. How you move ahead with it, I'm not quite so sure. I just have as much information and as detailed, no, authentic information available to the public as possible.
Yeah, I would agree with I would agree with that. And just to close it off, Jim, because I'm going to release you, gentlemen. With it's St. Patrick's Day, and some of us have places to go and pints to drink. But what I would just say is, it has been possible for Irish people, from my point of view, it has been possible for Irish people to commemorate Allied victory in the Second World War in their own way. Irish veterans travelled to Normandy. From the 1980s, 1990s onwards, Irish veterans of the airborne campaign, people who landed with 6th Airborne Division, and there were a lot of Irish in 6th Airborne Division, as there were in Arnhem, and Irish veterans went back to those commemoration sites, and they were interviewed. It became so notable that Irish television, RTE, travelled there and basically interviewed them on the locations where they were in their dress, veteran uniforms, wearing their berets, Red Devil berets, Irish paras commemorating what they did during the Second World War. And we all know how controversial the parachute regiment is in Ireland for reasons that we won't go into. You had Irish paras proudly talking about their experiences during the war and commemorating their sacrifices and those of their comrades. And so commemoration is ongoing. Irish people make pilgrimages to Normandy. And it goes back to the whole difference between the attitude of the state and the attitude of the people. Those of us who wish to remember will remember. The state is not compelled to do so, particularly if it feels uncomfortable in doing so, because it doesn't want to detract from the legacy of neutrality, which I think is one that, for various reasons that we mentioned in the show, is one that should be remembered. I'm sorry we can't bring Ronan in for a point on this, but I think he's made enough of a contribution tonight. So, Eddie, do you want to close out the show?
Well, I just want to thank you all for it all, and I just want to reaffirm my conviction that, in view of the fact, the contribution that Irish people, and the reason why Irish people in America and Australia and New Zealand, is because they were forced, in many respects, for economic and other reasons, to find a life, and it was a great source of suffering and sacrifice for many generations, including my own family. And they found themselves, nevertheless, involved and willing to serve, whether in the American Army, New Zealand Army, the South African Defence Force, or wherever they were. They did contribute, often as volunteers, in a victory. And I think it seems peculiar for me to work in Italy with a country which declared war against Britain in 1940, standing in a remembrance moment for 1945 and the celebration of the end of the war in Europe, the start of peace, and that somehow or other Ireland, the state that represents in the Irish people, the expression self-determination of the Irish people, is not there. So I think I can see the political arguments. They seem to me to be 80 years on, to be rather insignificant compared to the legacy of 1945 and the contribution made by so many people who are Irish or Irish descent. But it seems to me that maybe the running needs to be made by people like us, who are non-government actors, who work with an informal way, building relationships, and keep reminding people that when they look at this period, Ireland and the Irish people made a massive contribution. And I want to salute all the children and grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of veterans with Irish in their hearts who were happy to see Ireland do well in the Six Nations. I want you all to pat yourself on the back and do not forget that the victory and achievements of 1945 were also your victory. So
Eddie,
can I...
Eddie, I just want to make one last point that Ronan made, because he can't speak, not because he's been deprived of the powers of speech, but because tech failures. So he put in the private chat, Micheál Martin, who's the current Taoiseach, had two uncles in the Second World War, and I can just add to this point, one was captured at Singapore. So one of his uncles was in the British Army out in the Far East, and he was captured at Singapore, was a prisoner of war of the Japanese, and survived. That's the current Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland. So if you want to know how deep this runs,
exactly,
ask the Prime Minister, ask the Taoiseach.
Well, I would suggest, Ronan, in your capacity as an influential person in Ireland, that you should approach Mr. Martin and discuss this matter and say, well, look, I fully understand you have to respect this period, but it was an Irish victory as much as, you know, so many other nations. And shouldn't this in some way as an unifying expression? It's a unifying expression because it was, you know, the island and Northern Ireland, the people of Ireland, wherever they were. And the contribution was made by the people of Ireland, Irish people, to 1945, which led to the legacy of 80 years of largely unbroken peace, more than 80 years of largely unbroken peace that we've enjoyed, which meant that I, unlike my parents and my grandparents, didn't get vectored into a European war, and I've managed to live a life of peace and contentment. So anyway, that's my final word. Can I just say, thanks, guys, terrific. And I'm going to put you into the green room, which means that you're not gone, but it just means you're waiting, and I will close the show, and I'll do this systematically. And Joe, thanks very much. Brilliant hosting. You should do it more often. I can just sit there and do it.
I will indeed.
And so that's it for this week. It's been a brilliant conversation about a topic which I hope has shed light on something which continues to resonate in ways that we don't always find attractive or engaging. But that's part of the job that we're here to do, which is to share stories that are untold, to bring expertise to bear on it, and I hope to leave with you all a real legacy of an improved understanding of the Second World War. So from me and everybody here this week in the Second World War, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.